Welcome to the Hope and Wholeness Podcast, where we empower people to seize the day and flourish in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Duckworth, and I'm thrilled to have you aboard. I'm a disciple of Jesus, psychologist, husband, father, coach, real estate investor, and passionate mountain biker, and I'm here to walk alongside you. My mission? To infuse hope and foster wholeness into every aspect of your life. Each episode will give you a bird's eye view of authentic discussions on real life issues, followed by practical suggestions. Let's tackle your toughest questions and embark on this journey together. All right. Thank you all for joining us for today's episode of the Hope and Wholeness Podcast. Just a quick reminder to leave your comments, and also you can email questions to hwpc.podcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you guys. Today, I'm super excited to have Beth Bolthouse with us. She is a licensed professional counselor, and she's been working with me at Hope and Wholeness for 3 or so years, maybe a little bit more than that, something like that.
Something like that.
I've really
lose track of time.
Yes. But I've really enjoyed getting to know Beth over the last few years. And she is a very compassionate counselor. She has such a heart for people who are grieving, people who've gone through trauma, people who are going through difficult times. And she has a wide breadth of knowledge about trauma and grief and boundaries. She actually has 2 master's degrees, one in counseling and one in thanatology.
Yes.
And thanatology is basically the study of death and dying. Is that what?
Yep. Death and dying, grief and loss.
Death and dying, grief and loss.
Mm-hmm.
She's the co-founder of the Grief Club of West Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have basically grief support groups.
Yep.
Right.
They're all free of charge to folks that register and want to attend. Some are virtual, some are in person.
Yeah.
Yep.
And she is also the author of a workbook.
Yes.
So, and that workbook is called From Loss to
I
Life.
actually brought it with me today.
All right. Yeah.
Take a look at that.
So
it's available on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
So
we're going to discuss some of the content from that workbook today. We're going to take a pretty broad look at kind of the human response to trauma. We're going to talk a little bit about PTSD. And then we're really going to dive into Beth's area of expertise, which is basically kind of talking about the effect and the impact of religious or spiritual trauma and post-traumatic growth.
Yes.
So, and on a more personal note, Beth is an avid reader. She's a dog lover. In fact, we should have brought Isabel today. No.
Oh my gosh, she probably barked through the whole thing. But she is an adorable little thing.
So, and she enjoys also spending time with family and friends and her beautiful daughter.
Yes.
Right?
Yes,
So,
Rosemary.
All right.
Yep.
So, to get started, I'm going to try to provide a brief background on kind of our response to trauma. And we're going to go over very broadly the symptoms of PTSD, just for anybody who's not familiar with that topic.
Okay.
So when a person experiences a trauma, from my perspective and kind of the cognitive perspective that many psychologists take these days, we experience a trauma, and how our body and how our symptoms respond to that has a lot to do with what we believe about what happened. Why it happened. Was it our fault? Was it somebody else's fault? Was it because we were a bad person or we deserved it? And those types of thoughts, also thoughts about safety and trust, those really impact how we respond to a trauma. And many people basically, in fact, I forget what the statistics are, but I think upwards of 90 to 100% of people experience symptoms of PTSD immediately after a trauma, but oftentimes those symptoms remit after about 30 days, and a much lower percentage of people experience those symptoms on an ongoing basis. So usually we wait at least a month after before diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder. But there are basically 4 main clusters of symptoms that I want to tell you guys about with PTSD. One is re-experiencing symptoms. So these could be flashbacks, nightmares, replaying it in your head over and over again all day. Anything that makes a person kind of feel like the trauma is happening again, even if they know it's not happening again, that would be a re-experiencing symptom.
I think sometimes, too, people will re-experience and not realize that they're re-experiencing, especially if they've blocked out the trauma or they've suppressed it in some way and they don't really want to think about it. Then they'll experience those type of things and think, what's wrong with me? am I going crazy? Why do I feel this way? Why am I
Yeah.
thinking this way?
Yep.
And that can be a sign right there that maybe you need to explore the trauma.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings us to like the second cluster of symptoms are avoidance symptoms. And that can include dissociation,
Yeah.
and pushing thoughts away. And people will sometimes be surprised when they realize that a trauma is impacting them because they've avoided it, they pushed it away, they've said, oh, I'm going to pretend that never happened, I'm just going to forget about it, I'm just going to move on. And unfortunately, avoidance symptoms are some that can really increase the intensity and longevity of symptoms after someone experiences a trauma.
Yeah, for sure. And, it's so interesting too, because a lot of that factors into the patterns that people have in their lives. The unhealthy relationships, maybe they keep repeating over and over, or other things that go on. That can be also part of the avoiding. They don't understand what's going on, and it's all subconscious, but the trauma is what is driving it.
Yeah, absolutely. Patterns are so common. They're common in many disorders, but especially in PTSD. Usually there's a very strong repetitive pattern, and oftentimes it's that avoidance of that processing that trauma that keep us stuck in this pattern.
When you think about how trauma really forms our core beliefs, especially if trauma happened when you were young, and maybe when you were really young, and you're starting to internalize, something's wrong with me, it's all my fault, and you start to believe what your caregivers or other people, whether they're abusing you or not, the negative things that messages that you receive, you start to internalize those, and that becomes your truth.
Yep.
And then you start seeing the world through that lens.
That's right.
That's all trauma based.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to talk about how the lens that we get is so important. Even just generally when you're raising kids or whatever you might be doing, that first lens that you get is super hard to change.
Yeah.
And so that's part of why childhood trauma is oftentimes more damaging than trauma you might experience as an adult. Because as an adult, you can kind of process it and you can understand it potentially. As a child, you just interpret whatever conclusion you come to immediately. That becomes your lens through which to see all future, perhaps relationships, or even if it's car accident. This is how you see cars for the rest of your life.
Yeah,
I've met people that have had fear of cars, fear of driving for a lifetime.
Yeah. Or even just, I find too, working with people who struggle with boundaries. And one of the things I teach in my boundaries group is, all those negative things that we internalize really factor into whether we feel that we're able to set boundaries or whether our boundaries are legitimate. And if we receive positive, affirming messages growing up where we have caregivers that are encouraging and we don't experience any type of trauma, we're much more likely to have healthier relationships, but also not go into false guilt and to be able to set healthy boundaries in relationships, not only with others, but also with ourselves internally.
Yeah. Definitely want to dive into more of that.
Yeah.
So the third cluster of symptoms is negative emotional experiences. And so this is really that shame, that guilt, oftentimes depression, withdrawal, social
Anxiety.
isolation. Yeah. So this is kind of where a lot of people find their emotions becoming very labile and vacillating very quickly. A lot of people will think, oh, am I bipolar? I'll think, no, probably not.
Or somebody will label them like borderline when they're really not borderline. They just have some of those symptoms because it's the trauma reacting out.
Right. Yeah. And so that emotional disturbance piece of PTSD is oftentimes where people get an anger from as well. A lot of men or veterans will experience a very easily triggered anger response. And oftentimes that is kind of part of that emotional disturbance from PTSD as well. And the final cluster of symptoms would be hyperarousal. So this would be where hypervigilance would come in. People who are kind of looking around, very aware. Am I in danger? Am I safe? Can I trust this person? Can I not? Difficulty sleeping, difficulty relaxing.
Hard to trust.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you just don't have that safety in relationships.
Yeah. So those are basically the four main clusters of reactions to trauma. And of course, people who might be listening, don't diagnose yourselves.
Right. Don't Google, do I have trauma?
Yeah. But you don't have to have post-traumatic stress disorder to have a reaction to trauma that you may need to process, and that it may benefit you to walk through that with a mentor, professional counselor, or something like that. But this is kind of what we're talking about today. And I don't know about you, Beth, but I can say that I've had moments in my life where I've definitely experienced these reactions
Mhm.
to events in my life.
Yeah.
And without the ability to process through these, I've been blessed and had good mentors, parents, and
Mhm.
friends to help me to make appropriate conclusions about a trauma. I
Mhm.
did not experience any trauma as a child. Well, you could say that I did when I broke my femur when I was in sixth grade. I think I mentioned that in one of my episodes. But even that, I made sense of that, I feel like, in a pretty healthy way because of the support that I had around me
Mhm.
and because of my spiritual beliefs.
Yeah.
Um, but these are very common experiences for people who go through trauma.
Mhm. Yeah, and I would say too, some of my story. I had a lot of trauma throughout my life, and really, spent a long time in therapy. And it takes time. It really takes time
Mm,
to start to reframe and not only reframe, but start to challenge the
mhm.
thinking patterns and start to
Yeah,
challenge those core beliefs, because you don't know what's true.
yeah,
And, it really takes time as you unpack it and start to realize, okay,
mm,
that was a lie, this is true, and start to see yourself, especially as God sees us,
mhm,
because He is the one who created us. He
mm,
didn't want us to go through it,
right.
but, He helps us now deal with it, and
Mhm,
hopefully we can use it. I want to say, too, He was with us through it.
yeah,
And there are things maybe He prevented from happening that
yeah,
we don't even know about.
right.
I think that's an important piece as well. So,
Yeah, yeah. We discussed that in some depth in a previous episode on why
okay.
bad things happen.
Okay.
But I think that it's really good to bring it up here too, that a lot of people say like God will allow this to happen.
Mhm.
And I think that that is sometimes true, that God allows things to happen. He created a world and
Mhm.
he's letting the world play itself out. He
Yeah.
created it to function a certain way and it's not happening according to his will. I think that's sometimes where people get confused, is that just
Mhm.
because God
Right.
allows something to happen doesn't mean that that was his will
Right.
for that to happen. And his
Right.
promise is that he will work those things together for good. And so, although he wishes we didn't have to go through that,
Mhm.
he helps us recover, can help us recover in a way to where we are stronger,
Mhm.
that we're better off, even with something negative that we have in our past.
I heard a pastor say, I think it might have been Mexicato. I remember driving and hearing this, and I thought, wow, that's so simple but so profound. And he said, when you were born, God, God's will was for you to be cherished and
Hmm.
loved and cared for.
Hmm.
But people have free will. And if you weren't cherished and loved and cared for, it's not because that wasn't His will for you.
Hmm.
It's because the people that raised you or took care of you
Hmm.
did not do it in the way that He intended.
Yeah,
And so that's the other piece too. He wants to recreate that within us so
yeah,
that we can start to recognize what we do deserve, what we do need, and especially not only people in our lives, but looking to Him for that
yeah,
so that He becomes our true parent,
yeah,
and our truth about ourselves really comes from Him and our
yeah,
identity in Him.
yeah. And if you're listening and if that feels really untrue to you, or if that feels really far away from what you could believe, that God is a good father who loves you and cares about you and wants to be with you and wants to be real
Mhm.
to you, I really do encourage you to reach out to a Christian counselor,
Mhm.
reach out to somebody at Hope and Wholeness, reach out to someone, because that's oftentimes where it starts. You're not alone in
Mhm.
feeling that that's not real for you, or that
Right.
that wouldn't apply to you. I think that that is very normal for people
Mhm.
to have a difficult time. It's difficult for us to set aside kind of our beliefs about
Mhm.
certain things and be able to open ourselves up to what God really has to offer to us.
Well, and especially too, sometimes people are traumatized. I know we were going to talk about this maybe a little bit later, but traumatized by church.
Mhm.
I grew up in a very strict fundamentalist Baptist church, and that combined with other trauma in my life, I formed this perception of God as this really angry God
Mm,
out to get me all the time. There was nothing I could do. He was always out to punish me. And I really didn't know Jesus, who He really was, other than you have to ask Him into your heart. I knew that from
yeah.
when I was a little kid. But I lived a lot of my life being so afraid of God. And then when people would call Him Father, I didn't know how to
Mm,
connect with that.
mhm.
And I used to really stress and wonder about that. And that was part of my healing process too. But again, it took years to really start to see God in a different way for who He was. And part of that process was really getting to know who Jesus is.
Mhm.
And, He says in Scripture, I am the Father.
Yeah.
And, you see the Father through me. And when I started realizing, wow, this loving, caring Savior that affirmed women and totally, was so filled with grace
Mm.
and healed people and
Yeah.
wanted the best for them and, you know, didn't condemn them
That's
for,
right.
seeking help. In
Yeah.
fact, the only people he condemned were the religious leaders.
Right. Yeah.
If that is who God is, then man, I got to reframe who God is.
That's
And
right.
so after my divorce, I remember first couple of years, I spent a lot of time just really talking to God about that and
Yeah.
praying about that. Show me who you really are. Show me
Yeah.
who you really
That's so good.
are.
And I love that you, use Jesus as a lens through which to
Mm-hmm.
see God, because
Yeah.
Jesus says several times that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Yes.
And that I'm only doing what I've seen the Father do, and I'm
Yeah.
only saying what I've heard the Father say. He's the perfect representation of God. And we even have to interpret the Old Testament through that lens. And I don't
Yes.
have all the answers for that. I'm not a
Yeah.
theologian, but I know for a fact that Jesus
Mm-hmm.
is the representation of God. He represents the heart of God towards
Mm-hmm.
mankind. So,
Absolutely.
so Beth, tell us a little bit more about this kind of spiritual or religious church trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Tell us kind of what you see sometimes coming into your office. Like, how do
Okay.
people describe it? What types of experiences have people had? Because I think that, uh, for me at least, I it, not until I started learning in graduate school about trauma did I really think that somebody could experience trauma in church. I was
Mm-hmm.
pretty naive.
Yeah.
But tell us how that sometimes plays out and what you've seen.
There's so many ways. First of all, just my own story of growing up seeing God in that way, I think was traumatizing.
Mm,
Because then how are you free to really worship and feel free to really trust God and know that He's going to come through for you? Because all His
yeah.
promises almost mean nothing. Another thing I see often, especially when people have had a significant loss that maybe um, was not an acceptable loss,
Oh,
where maybe there was a suicide or a drug overdose.
okay.
Sometimes people in church judge that. There's also different forms that judgment can take. Maybe there's an out of wedlock pregnancy,
Yeah.
depending on the type of church that people go to. Sometimes people are shunned for being gay and
Hmm.
not allowed to come back to church. I've
Yeah.
heard several stories like that. Or maybe a person doesn't believe the same as their family, and therefore their family assigns level of spiritual judgment on them and maybe doesn't want to have anything to do with them or doesn't accept them because they don't believe the same.
Hmm.
And yeah, there's just all different kinds of
Yeah.
trauma that can take place. And um, I think the other piece too is people's faith gets mixed up. When you experience something terrible, you want to believe that the people in your life are there for you, especially in a church. And oftentimes they don't either know what to do, or they're there for a little while, and then they start to feel like you need to get over it. In fact, I got a call one time from someone I knew many years ago, and I'm friends with her on Facebook, and she called and said, "Hey, I just want to talk to you. There's a woman in my church that is grieving the loss of her son, and it's been like, 6 months or more, and she just won't get over that. And I don't know what's wrong with her." And I trying to explain, child loss is the most significant loss, and you don't get over it. This is something that she needs empathy and she needs emotional support and acceptance for where she's at. And this person just couldn't quite
Mm,
understand
yeah.
about that. And the tendency, a lot of times, depending on the type of church you're in, is to kind of, I call it putting on a spiritual band aid.
Mm,
Let's find a Bible verse that'll solve all your problems, make you feel better.
yeah.
Or they're told, you're not trusting God enough.
Yeah.
Or was the person saved? And wow, if they weren't saved, then you'll never see them again.
Yeah.
Or they're in a better place. Sometimes people say that as comfort, and that's not comforting at all.
Or God is in control.
Yeah, God is in control. Well, then why didn't He keep my loved
Exactly.
one here?
Yeah.
And so it's okay to question that, and it's okay to challenge it,
Yeah.
even.
So, what, when did you and how did you realize that you had experienced church trauma?
Well, I think I was thinking the other day, the two significant times in my life, and the first time I didn't realize it was really trauma because I grew up in that fundamentalist religious culture, and so I accepted it that this was normal and okay.
Yeah.
But I was a church secretary back in the '80s, and I had gotten married, and my husband, after a year, decided he didn't want to be married anymore. So we were in the process of getting a divorce, and I was going to lose my job because I was going to be divorced. I mean, who does that? You know, like I didn't comprehend that that is
Wow.
not okay
Wow.
because of all the times that a woman needs a job is when she's going through a
Wow.
divorce, when she's going to be single again and doesn't have a double income. But there again, the church culture was divorce is not okay. Therefore, you need to be done with your job. We can't have somebody here on staff that's divorced.
Wow.
So, you know, like I said, at the time I took it just as the normal thing, and God was really good and provided a job that was way better, you know, and more money and all that stuff at the time. But when I look back on it, I think, wow, that would bother me so much today, you know?
Yeah.
And another time was I was in leadership at a church for many years, and the leadership in the church changed. And I started feeling a need to confront some of the issues that were going on that were really unethical and sinful. And as a result, I was fired without any reason or anything like that. And that just really affected me. I felt so betrayed. I
Mm.
thought, what is wrong that they aren't seeing the truth? And, you know, when you're in that situation, and again, you know, no unemployment, you know, just boom, I'm done. And then trying to start over. And I was doing counseling at the time at the church, and then trying to find a place to do counseling out of. And um, boy, you know, that's another time in my life when I just clung to God. And did I struggle with negative things? Yes. I even went down a dark hole of maybe I should, you know, be done with my life. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't dwell on that, but it was very much the path I started going down.
Yeah.
And I remember specifically one morning I was so depressed, I didn't know what I was going to do. Um, and I remember it was almost like an angel tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You need to start a gratitude list." And I
Mm.
thought, yeah, right. Okay, whatever. I don't have anything to
Yeah.
be grateful for, you know. I was so mad and hurt.
Yeah.
And I sat down. I remember I opened up my notebook and I thought, okay, what can I put on this list? And I think I came up with like one thing, you know. But that became a daily occurrence so that every morning I would write down the good things that had happened in the last 24 hours. And I
Yeah.
started filling up pages.
Yeah.
And then I started like seeing things that I never would have noticed before. And I started seeing God, you know, coming through, you know, somebody would just show up randomly. I felt you were on my mind and hand me a card with $50 in it.
Wow.
Or bring groceries by and leave it on my porch. I didn't know who they came from.
So
You
cool.
know, stuff like that. And then it was kind of interesting because that's how I got into grief work because I didn't know what to do about a job. And I was doing some counseling on the side, and somebody contacted me and said, hey, there's a hospice that needs a grief counselor for a grief group, but, you know, they don't pay anything.
Of
It'd
course.
just be a volunteer position.
As often as us counselors hear something like
Oh,
that, it's crazy.
and I'm like, oh, thank you, God. Wow, you have a sense of humor here.
Mm-hmm.
But I went ahead and did it. And then they hired me within a couple months. And then I became full time. And that's how I started doing grief counseling. My eye is watering. Yeah, I don't know if
Fine.
it's
You're
tears or
fine.
just whatever. But, anyways, and that's how I got into grief counseling. And I didn't know much about grief at the time either. I mean, I used the stages of grief, which, as I came to learn, relates to people at end of life, not people who are actually grieving.
Mm.
We don't go through nice, neat little stages
Yeah.
when we're grieving. We go through all kinds of stuff, and it's
Yeah.
personal and long term sometimes. Um, but yeah, so that's how I got into,
Yeah.
and then that was 15 years of doing
Yeah.
grief full time.
So do you think that it was around the time that you got fired that you kind of started to become more convinced that what you were experiencing was wrong?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
okay.
And you know, it really affected me because, um, you know, everyone has an opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember this one little old lady that everyone looked up to as a very spiritual person. And she was part of the team that let me go.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember somebody telling me, yeah, she was walking around the church the other day saying, you know, we really need to pray for Beth. And I'm like, I didn't do anything wrong. You know, I wasn't in sin that they had to let me go, but that was the impression that people got. And that was so hurtful.
Yeah.
And it took me a long time to go back to church after that.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
imagine it did. So you've alluded to this a little bit, but I know that part of what you really know a lot about is how grief sometimes is in the midst of
Mm.
kind of a trauma response.
Yeah, for sure.
And I hadn't thought about it that way really until I started talking with you about it a little
Mhm.
bit. So Can you explain how that works? How grief just goes right along with a trauma sometimes?
Yeah, well, all trauma is loss when you think about it.
Okay.
Loss of security, loss of safety,
Yeah.
loss of caring, nurturing caregivers sometimes, loss of acceptance, loss of love, judgment is a loss. There's all different kinds of losses that we experience when we go through trauma. And we don't usually identify that part of our trauma response is grief. And grief can take all kinds of forms. It can take anger, it can take sadness, it can take anxiety, panic attacks. Um, we maybe act out in different ways. We get into unhealthy relationships or unhealthy patterns or some type of addiction as a reaction to grief when we don't know that we're grieving.
Mhm.
And the tendency with grief, I've found, is that a lot of times, grief is quote unquote acceptable for a certain amount of time to most people.
Yeah.
You lose someone to death, okay, it's okay to grieve for the first few weeks, maybe a month,
Yeah.
but then people go on with their lives. And a lot of times they'll look back at you, oh, you're still grieving that? It's been 3 months. What's wrong
Yeah.
with you? And you're
Yeah.
like, I lost the love of my life. I
Yeah.
lost my child. Like people don't get
Yeah.
it. And so then the griever starts to feel like, well, maybe there's something wrong with me. So then instead of acknowledging how they're feeling, they start to push those feelings down. I
Right.
shouldn't be feeling this way.
Right.
And that also is a loss because then I'm not free to just feel how I am
Right.
and focus on what I need to focus on to deal with this and work through it,
Yeah, and that lens that they create of something's wrong with me then
Yes.
begins the lens that through which they interpret
Yep.
almost all of their experiences.
Yep. Yep.
So they're very unlikely at that point to stick up for themselves. You start to see an
Right.
effect on self-esteem and
Yeah.
self-confidence because they question themselves and they're always wondering, am I in the wrong? I probably am,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, that's where we go, especially if we
Mhm.
grew up with that type of core belief system
Yeah.
too. Another thing too is so interesting. Many, many, many years ago, this person came in to process the grief of their spouse, and they were telling me their story and all that stuff, and I'm like thinking to myself, this person seems like they're managing okay. I wonder why their doctor sent them here because the doctor wanted her to come talk to me, and at the very end of the session, she said, "If I ask you something, if I tell you something, will you not let anyone else know?" And I said, "Well, yeah, yeah, as long as you're not going to hurt yourself."
Yeah.
She goes, I think I have Alzheimer's. I think I'm going crazy. And we started to talk, and it was like 10 minutes left, but I just, we talked for a while. But, and starting to hear what she was going through was the grief of grief brain, we call it, where you don't remember things, you get confused, you have short-term memory loss, you can't remember where you put your keys, and you feel like you're going crazy, and you can't focus, and you're exhausted, and there's so many
Mhm.
things, and that also contributes to a sense of something's wrong with me.
Yeah.
And so to recognize that's a normal part of grief too,
Yeah.
which also I think ties into the trauma because we
Yep.
can feel that way when we're traumatized, like
Mhm.
something's wrong with me. I
Yeah.
don't know how to even function right now.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. This is one part that makes trauma, there's a lot of parts that make it confusing, but there's one part that makes it confusing. We've been talking about how we develop beliefs that are
Mhm.
basically inaccurate,
Mhm.
that really impact how we see the world and how we live our lives and what we feel on the inside. There's also this aspect that you're talking about with grief, where there's natural emotions that it makes sense you'd feel that way.
Mhm.
And it makes sense that you're sad that you've lost your sense of safety, you've lost your sense of security, and
Mhm.
you probably won't ever feel that safe again. And really, you have to process that loss.
Yeah,
You have to
exactly.
acknowledge it and you have to accept it. And when you accept it, then you can move towards a healthy or at least balanced belief about your safety. Because anything bad could happen to us at any time. That's
Yeah.
just the reality that we
But
have to
it's not that
acknowledge.
simple. I don't think we need to accept the loss as much as we have to start to accept this is how I feel.
Mm,
And maybe some losses we don't want to accept.
yeah,
And some of the parents I work with, why should they ever accept what happened to their child?
yeah,
So I always encourage them to try to come to terms with it.
mm,
How can I now use this to bring meaning to my life in a
yeah,
different way and carry forth my child's legacy and do something that will honor that child?
yeah, yeah. So framing acceptance of reality
Yeah,
in terms of what can I do with this?
yes. Which is part of post-traumatic growth because you start looking at how have I changed? Because when you go through a significant loss, And when you go through trauma, which, to me, they're hand in hand, um, you change. You are not the
Mm.
person you were before you went through that.
Yep.
And especially if you have many different experiences or even one or two,
Mm.
you're also changing as each trauma
Yeah.
or each, you know, traumatic loss happens.
Mm.
And so you can't go back to who you were.
Yeah.
You want to sometimes, and certainly a lot of people in our lives want us to. In fact, that's
Yeah.
why people abandon us or ghost us.
Yeah.
We're not who we used to be, and they don't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
And so then they kind of go on with their lives, and we're like, huh, where'd everybody go?
Mm.
But that's always not bad either, because we can
Yeah.
find new people. But yeah, and post-traumatic growth really wants to take a look at how can I become more resilient by identifying, what is my life like now? What are some things I really am passionate about? Challenging those core beliefs. What did I believe before my loss? And now what is my belief about that now?
Yeah.
And starting to really look at, how can I have meaning? How can I have a sense of purpose now?
Yeah.
Because maybe that was completely shattered. Certainly when I lost my job at the church, I thought I'd be there forever. And that really affected my identity.
Mm.
And God used that to show me that my identity was more in the church than in Him.
Mm.
And that was an important thing for me to realize,
Yeah. So, in my experience, you know that I'm trained in cognitive processing
Yeah,
therapy,
yeah.
and that's a very structured 12-session treatment for PTSD.
Okay.
And oftentimes, when people engage in that fully, it's very successful in terms of reducing PTSD symptoms. Would you say, um, I know it's not quite this uh, cut and dry, but would you say that post-traumatic growth usually starts after somebody kind of gets through treatment or they start to challenge some of those beliefs? Does growth start after that? Is it the process of, okay, taking these new beliefs and now creating a life built on them? Is that what you would
Mm.
describe post-traumatic growth, or is it something that you'd say is a little different?
Um, I would say that it's a little bit different. When I use post-traumatic growth principles with people, I don't usually use it in a linear path.
Okay.
It depends on where the person's at. And I will, sometimes it takes a year or more to help people start to look at things a little bit differently. I'll plant little seeds because they're not
Okay.
always ready to hear,
Yeah.
like the structure of what a post-traumatic growth would be.
Yeah.
And so helping them identify one thing that I do that I start with usually is how did you learn to grieve when you were a kid? What
Okay.
was the family of origin way of grieving or not grieving?
Yeah.
And a lot of times that will open up a lot too, that's why I don't deal with it. I just feel
Mm.
like I need to replace the loss with something else, which is where, maybe addictions start or unhealthy lifestyle or looking for a different person. A lot of times after a divorce, someone, instead of dealing with the grief, will just look for another relationship.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, so I always usually will start planting seeds with that and processing that and unpacking that, and then looking at what are the unhealthy patterns that I've engaged in my life
Mm.
in general,
Yeah.
and do any of those relate to how now I'm dealing with this
Yeah.
wound and this hurt, and then start to look at, how can I start to appreciate my life? How can I take a look at what my life was and what it is now, and start to find meaning and purpose? And legacy is a big part of that too. If,
Okay.
especially, and I keep bringing up child loss because I have a lot of people that I work with that have lost a child. Um, when a child dies, there's a sense of now what? This person, this was, um, there was such a bond and such a connection that we had.
Yeah.
And now my life has no meaning.
Right. Because their life in their head was built around this child for the
Yes,
next 20 some
exactly.
years or whatever.
Yeah. And there's no future.
Yeah.
There's no
There's no
hopes. There's
future.
no wedding. There's
Yeah.
no graduation, maybe if they were
Yeah.
younger. They didn't get to see what they would become. There's no grandchildren. You don't know what they would have done with their life, et cetera.
Yeah.
And it's just so start to think, how can I give my child a legacy? And how can I start to live my life in a way that brings meaning to their life
Yeah.
so that people don't forget them? And some folks have established maybe scholarships for in honor of their
Yeah.
children, or maybe they go on different walks, suicide walks, or they go across country for gift of life things. Or you have to find what's your niche, what's meaningful for you.
Yeah.
And it can be really small. It can be just a matter of, maybe your child was very artistic and did a lot of paintings, and it's a matter of, posting those on Facebook. I think
Yeah.
it's so important that people talk about their kids too.
Yeah.
or talk
Yeah.
about, whether it's a child, whether it's a spouse, or whoever it is, talk about them.
Yeah.
Not everyone's going to be receptive
Yeah.
to that, but other grievers, they will be,
Yeah.
and they will value that.
Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing you say is that post-traumatic growth is not a linear process, but it oftentimes occurs over a long period of time, oftentimes while you're treating PTSD, and
Yeah.
also continues after maybe PTSD is quote treated.
Yeah.
And but I think it sounds like the emphasis or the fruit of post-traumatic growth is when you maybe have challenged a lot of your beliefs and you have resolved some of those PTSD symptoms, and it's about building a new life that is different from the one that you imagined.
Yes.
It's based on gratitude, and it's
hmm
based on legacy,
And
and it's
mindfulness.
meaning,
Yeah.
mindfulness, and
hmm
purpose in life.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah. I
accurate?
would say so. And
Okay.
it really helps you build more resilience,
Okay.
and you can start to reconnect with joy little by little. And that's important too. Joy is not the same as happiness. Our life, maybe your life is never going to be happy again, but to see the little glimmers of joy,
Mm.
start to realize I can experience positive things,
Yeah.
and, what's really sad to me is when someone is so lost in their grief, they don't know what to do. And I've seen people where, um, maybe it's their spouse, maybe it's a sibling or a parent even, or a child. They lose that person, and then they're afraid to work through some of the grief, or even start to go through some of the post-traumatic growth processes,
hmm
because their relationship with that person now is about the grief, not about who that person was, and not about the relationship they actually had. So the relationship
Mm.
becomes the grief rather than the person. And so
Wow.
continuing bonds
Yeah.
is another really important piece
Yeah. Wait,
too.
let's say that again. So a person's grief becomes more about the loss
A
than
person's they start to develop a relationship with the grief more than the relationship with the
they
person.
start to develop a relationship
Yeah.
more with the grief
Yeah.
than with the person they lost.
Yeah.
Wow. That's so people who are grieving will get really stuck and attached to and in a relationship with the loss, with the grief
Yeah.
itself,
Yeah.
and they lose maybe some of the positive memory or connection that they had with the actual person.
hmm Well, you see it sometimes where you can notice it, especially when you have a family where one person passed away that was really important to a parent, let's say. And that's all that parent focuses on, is that one person that's
Mm-hmm.
gone.
Yeah.
And it's almost like they don't have anybody else in their
Yeah.
lives. And so, yeah, the relationship, because what if I really do start to make meaning out of this situation? What if I
Yeah.
really do start to have a life again? But then I'll lose them again because I'm not grieving them as much.
Mm.
So there becomes that. Now, continuing bonds is really important. And that's a concept where you start to think, okay, yes, they are gone, but how can I stay connected to them?
Yeah.
You can write to them. You can talk to them.
Yeah.
You can do things in their memory. Maybe I know one family, they have a birthday party every year for
Oh,
their son's birthday when
yeah.
that comes around. I think that's so
That's
important
really cool.
because you don't forget them.
Yeah.
You're honoring them,
Yeah.
and yet you're doing it as a family. Maybe
Yeah.
you invite their friends over, and you find different ways to stay connected to them.
Yeah.
Maybe, sometimes if there's been cremation, I've known folks who they take a country trip or a trip across the country, and they will take the ashes, and maybe for them, they want to scatter them different places so they feel like
Yeah.
their loved one is with them.
Yeah.
Or, just different ways you can do it. Sometimes they put Facebook pages up and they post different memories, and
Yeah.
there's all kinds of things that
Yeah.
you can do to
I
stay connected.
love that term, continuing bonds. So,
hmm
obviously people are in all sorts of different stages, and some are maybe
hmm
not ready for that. But
Yeah.
part of post-traumatic growth is not, or part of recovering from loss is not forgetting about that person or that
hmm
loss. It's about um, remembering that
hmm
person, who they were,
Yeah.
and continuing your bonds with that person. So I think that there might be a misconception with a lot of people that doing that will reactivate and trigger all their
Yeah.
grief, and it'll set them back. Can you
hmm
maybe say a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, it is an up and down process your whole life, depending on how significant the loss was. And it doesn't have to be the loss of a person. It could be the loss of, like for me, a job that I absolutely loved.
Mm-hmm.
It took me many years to really, really process that. And I had a lot of ups and downs.
Okay.
It still does affect me a little bit today. I struggle with church.
Okay.
Um, and I don't go to church right now because I also had lost a beloved church that I had in the meantime. They closed and that was hard.
Oh,
And
okay.
then COVID hit, all of that.
Yeah.
But, it's a process for me too. But you have to also say it's okay that it's a process.
Yeah.
I also want to talk for a second about the term recovering,
Okay.
because recovery means that we can go back to how we were, and we never were. You can't go back
Yeah.
to what you were before the loss. So I don't like using the word recovery.
Okay.
I think that, you have to find your own words that you want to use. But, maybe it's more about finding your way and finding meaning in your life
Yeah.
that, you aren't the person you used to be.
Right.
And so, because even your values might have changed.
Yeah.
What was important to you then maybe isn't anymore. You
Yeah.
have other things that are more important. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I like that distinction. Recovery does give the implication that you're recovering something that was lost.
yes.
Where in this case, that's not possible.
Yeah.
But recovery in a sense of moving forward and finding who you are and finding joy in life and things like that, while still maintaining some connections to the loss, if it's a person or
Yes.
something like that.
Yeah. Or if
is
it's
possible.
not a person, like in my situation, how can I make that job loss meaningful now?
Yeah.
It took time to really figure it out, but I found a different way.
Yeah.
Grief became so much more a part of my life. It's my specialty. I have a master's in
Yeah.
it. And I started realizing, because while I was working at hospice, I also had a very small clientele on the side that I would work with for other things, anxiety. Sometimes there were addictive type tendencies, relationship issues. And I started realizing, all these folks, there's really loss there that's unresolved, that's behind the addictions or behind the relationship choices or behind the anxieties. And so understanding grief better started to help me relate not only to people who have lost a loved one to death, but starting to identify and look for, okay, what are the losses that you haven't grieved?
Yeah.
And, when you think about, a child, maybe their parents get divorced when they're like 12 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you have a 50-year-old man that, he, is dealing with porn and he's dealt with it his whole life. Well, back when he was vulnerable at 12 years old, one of his buddies exposed him to that, and that started him down a path of trying to feel better and using porn for that. And so you can start to see how that unresolved grief, because nobody talked to him about the divorce,
Yeah.
nobody talked to him about how to deal with the loss of that, and and helping navigate him through that.
Yeah.
It became so problematic that affected him most of his life.
Yeah. Sure. Well, Beth, I'm thinking that maybe we could go into maybe spending the next 10 or so minutes on giving kind of some practical suggestions to our listeners.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So we've talked about a lot of different things today.
Yeah, we have.
We have focused on kind of trauma and loss, which oftentimes go together, but there's just such a wide range of the types of traumas and losses that people have experienced. But we're going to try to give you guys some kind of practical suggestions if you've experienced a loss, or if there's someone that has experienced a loss. We're going to just try and go, rapid fire and give you guys some ways to apply some of the complex stuff that we've been talking about today. Does that sound okay, Beth?
Yeah, sounds good.
So what are some things that come to your mind? Let's say first with people who've experienced some religious trauma or some church trauma, and maybe they haven't really worked through any of that.
I think for that, as well as other traumas or losses, I think, first of all, what are you feeling?
Okay.
In my workbook, I have a appendix which has a ton of different feeling words.
Mm-hmm.
Google feeling words. You can find lists all over the place, and start to really put words to your feelings.
Okay.
And I think that's really important. Sometimes I'll ask people, take this list and check off every day, what am I feeling? And see at the end of the week, how many of them have check marks next to them.
Yeah.
Because you then start to see these are the main feelings I'm having. So that's really important. That goes to acknowledging.
Yeah.
For people with religious trauma, I think it's also really important to start to, I hate to use this word, but, where you, oh shoot, now I forgot the word. Where you
Deconstruct.
Yeah, deconstruct.
Yeah.
I was thinking dissect. You start to deconstruct, what do I really believe?
Yeah.
And that goes back to the post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
What do I really believe about God?
Yeah.
And what do I want to know about God?
Yeah.
And start to engage with him, write him letters.
Yeah.
What I found helpful when I was going through my counseling, and I did this just on my own, I started going through each psalm individually and writing about it, unpacking that psalm as it relates to me.
Yeah.
And that really helped me a lot because it helped me to feel validated, because a lot of the psalms really identify pain and hurt and loss and anger. But it also started to open my eyes more to the promises of God that the psalmist would cling to too.
Yeah.
And so that was really helpful for me.
Yeah. So, Beth's first suggestion is to start acknowledging how you feel. And I would firmly agree with that. And I think that one of the main reasons why we recommend this is because you have to start not avoiding.
Right.
Avoidance is one of these symptoms that keeps PTSD and trauma responses going. And so, unfortunately, it does require that you start acknowledging your feelings. And if you write some things down, it may be a little painful. It may trigger you a little bit. You might
It doesn't
use that
have to be
word.
a lot either.
Yeah. But that's going to give you some clues as to kind of what your next steps should be. You have to acknowledge how you're feeling and what your response to that experience was.
Something else I use too is truth cards.
Okay.
Like, what am I believing right now about the situation, especially if it's a trigger? And then just write that down, just acknowledge it. And then start to reframe that. Okay, this is what I'm feeling, but are my feelings legitimate?
Yeah.
Are my feelings truthful?
Yeah.
And what is truthful? And
Yeah.
maybe you don't know, but that can be part of the process too, trying to determine that.
And I don't love the term deconstructing
Yeah.
either because I don't even think most people know what it even
Yeah.
exactly means. But we're definitely using that term in a sense to encourage you to read scripture, to look and actually study what you actually believe and what is actually true. Because most of us, just like you and I, Beth, grow up in churches and we just believe whatever pastors say.
Right.
And unfortunately, pastors are saying crazy things, and they still are. As an adult, I still read the Bible sometimes. I'm like, what? This is in the Bible? Like, it was just yesterday. I was talking to my dad, and he's like, yeah, this is in Romans. I'm like, what? And I'm like, I'm looking at Romans like, dozens of times. I'm like, how did I never really get this before?
And read different translations.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion.
My favorite
too.
right now is the Passion Translation.
Oh, I like the Passion
Oh my
Translation.
gosh, it's so beautifully written. And I think it captures a lot of the nuances of the Greek.
Yeah.
And you can start to see things a little bit different perspective than the traditional NIV or King James or whatever.
So, and also back to the truth cards. If you are believing things like the trauma was your fault, or you deserved it, or it's because you're a bad person, or it makes you a bad person, or you'll never get past it, or you'll never be able to experience joy again or happiness again. And if you write those things down and you can't see a different way of looking at it, I think that's a really good indicator that you should probably talk to somebody about it. Because really, most people who are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, they firmly believe these beliefs, and they don't realize, and this is okay, they don't realize that those are the beliefs that are actually keeping them stuck.
Yeah.
If you're doubting your faith, doubting your salvation, doubting how much God loves you, and you can't see another way to look at it,
Right.
you need to talk to somebody. Because people who come to see me, I challenge them to look at it in a different way. And sometimes they don't want to. And sometimes this is the way they see it. And sometimes people come in and they'll say something like, this is my fault. And after actually hearing all the detail of their trauma, we actually realize that they did play a part. And they do have some responsibility for what happened. And that is also okay. It is our goal to really get them in line with reality, and we can work with that. But what is oftentimes missed are the parts that weren't this person's fault, or the part that they made a mistake, and it doesn't mean that they're a bad person or that they're going to hell or whatever it might mean.
Right.
So just know that there's hope for you.
Yeah.
And I know Beth can attest to this too, but we've worked with a lot of people, and sometimes it is absolutely a very long process. It's years and years.
It takes time. It really, and to be prepared for that. And sometimes I've had clients who are sporadic in coming in, and that's okay too, because I think it's scary.
Yeah.
You know, you don't know what you're going to uncover. And even just taking the risk of trusting a therapist,
Yeah.
that you're not going to be judged or looked at
Yeah.
in a weird way, you know.
Yeah.
And also what you just said too, I want to also maybe tweak it a little bit, that as a child is never, ever
Mm.
responsible for anything,
Right.
any abuse that happens to them, any trauma that happens to them.
Of course.
And one thing with the truth cards, if you're not a Christian and you don't really want to bring the Bible into it,
Yeah.
you know, then I guess I would say a simple way of looking at what am I believing and how am I taking this in and what is the truth? Well, what would you say to a friend who told you that this happened to them?
Yeah.
Would you tell them, oh, that's your fault, you were wrong? No, you'd be
Yeah.
like, oh, you didn't do anything wrong. That person was evil and
Yeah.
mean and, you know, and start to reframe it maybe that way.
Yeah.
And that can help too.
And if you try to say, no, it's different for me,
Yeah.
then you need to talk to somebody.
Then I would say, are you really above everybody else then, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Why is it
Yeah.
why do you have to be the scapegoat
Yeah.
and the martyr, you know,
Yeah.
that stuff? Because you
But
don't have to be.
what about for family or friends of people who are struggling with maybe a response to trauma, something like that?
I think it's really important to be patient, and empathy goes a long way. You know,
Yeah.
you may not agree.
Mhm.
You know, maybe you think, well, they need to be over it, but
Yeah.
you don't ever tell them that. You
Yeah.
just listen and try to put yourself in their shoes.
Yeah.
You know, especially if you're someone that you're trying to support somebody, but yet you can't relate to what they're going
Yeah.
through. Still try to imagine, okay, if this was my life and I went through what this person went through, how might I be feeling? And, you know, that can take some practice to kind of start to develop more empathy toward that person.
Yeah.
But listening is always appropriate,
Yeah.
not judging, not sharing what they tell you with anybody either. You know, keeping that confidence
Yeah.
with that person, and sometimes just presence,
Yeah.
just being with them.
Yeah.
You know, because they're not going to heal at our rate. They're
Right.
not going to do what we wish they would do.
Yeah.
And, so, you know, we can do more harm than good, and
Yeah.
definitely don't ghost them.
Yeah.
That just re-triggers things that, you know, that can re-trigger, I really am
Yeah.
unworthy. I really
Yeah.
am, something's wrong with me. I really am damaged goods.
Right.
And that can just, you know, totally
Yeah.
destroy
Yeah. I would also
things.
recommend healthy boundaries, because sometimes people
Mhm.
struggle with trauma, especially if they're not willing to address
Mhm.
any of it. They're a lot.
Yeah.
And so yeah, absolutely 100% don't ghost
Mhm.
them. Show them
Yeah.
love, show them empathy. But also don't push yourself so hard or
Yes.
feel all this responsibility
Yeah.
like you have to help them with this, especially when they're not helping themselves,
Right.
because you're going to get exhausted and you probably are going to say something
Yeah.
that's probably going to be more harmful than good.
Well, even as counselors, you know, we have to be careful that we don't let people become dependent on us.
Right.
I remember, this is ages ago, but I remember I had this one client that every time something happened, she'd call me. And I used to talk to her about journaling. And I thought, what can I do to kind of help her journal more? And so the next time she called me, I said, well, have you journaled yet? Nope. I want you to journal one page and then call me back.
Yes.
And then she never called me back. And then when I saw her next time, she goes, oh, well, when I wrote it down, I worked it through.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yes, that's what I want you to do. You know,
Yeah.
sometimes it's not that simple.
Yeah.
But if you are supporting someone, it is important that you know your limits.
Yeah.
And you choose when you are available and when you're not. And it's okay to say, you know, maybe that person gets triggered by saying, no, I can't do this. So then you say, you know, that's not going to work for me right now, but offer another option. So they know that you're not just blowing them off.
Yeah.
But it takes time to get to know that person and have patience with them. And you're also not responsible for their triggers.
Yeah.
You know, if they get triggered or you trigger them, you don't even know it.
Yeah.
You're not responsible for that. But that
Right.
doesn't mean that we don't show compassion
Right.
and empathy, you know.
Yeah. And I think that the patience thing is, we just can't emphasize that enough,
Mhm.
because
Yeah.
especially with complex trauma and people who develop
Mhm.
personality symptoms,
Yeah.
personality changes as a result of trauma.
Yeah.
Or maybe they had some of those even before trauma and they're really activated or really strong after the trauma. Like, it's really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, I highly recommend patience. And I highly recommend putting a team around you too. We're talking about a little bit more
Mhm.
difficult, cases right now, are people who are really struggling. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it absolutely takes a team.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
churches,
consistency.
yeah.
You know.
And churches are not great at this, but
Mhm.
I think that you think about your group of friends, think about the people who support you really well. And if
Mhm.
you can help this person also develop some
Mhm.
support that's
Yeah.
more than just you, I think that's really key. It's
Can be
really key to
huge.
know who to point them to who might even be able to better help them than you
Mm-hmm.
might. If they are seeing a therapist, sometimes it's helpful to say, I think your therapist might be a better person to talk to or get advice from about this
Yeah.
particular thing.
Yeah, that's a good boundary too.
Hmm.
Yep. I know when
So,
I was in therapy at one point in time, um, my therapist thought it'd be helpful to have a support person come to therapy with me sometimes. And this older lady, not real elderly, but she was a lot older than me, and that was very helpful for me. It really gave me extra support. It was someone I felt safe with, and it started to validate, I really am okay. I really
yeah,
can work through this. And so that was a really, really profound change. That was a positive change for me in that process.
yeah. So, I guess to wrap up, Beth, can you tell us who this workbook would be appropriate for? Is this appropriate for somebody to go through by
Yeah.
themselves, or do they need to do it with a therapist?
Yep. You can, I'll just hold it up again so you can see it. You can go through it by yourself. That's how I designed it. I also designed it to be done as a group. I've done several different groups using this material. There's worksheets, daily affirmations. There's just all different kinds of things that you can do in the workbook. I also have the website where you can download worksheets to print out if you don't want to write in the book. And it helps you, identify boundaries. It helps you identify, the spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical components of what you're struggling with. It helps you just really start to take away, what is my identity now? And even put together an identity statement. It guides you through writing to the loss, whether it's a person or something else, so that you can start to express how you really feel. And yeah, there's just a lot of material in here that, like I said, you could do it by yourself. You could do it with somebody, with a therapist, with a support person, or in a group.
Yeah, that's excellent. All
Yeah.
right, well, thanks. Well, I'll have Beth's contact info and that website and stuff
Yeah.
um, on my website here after we publish this. And if you guys have any questions, remember questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. We barely scratched the surface of, I'm sure, all the really specific, unique circumstances that you all have
Yeah.
in your lives. So we would be happy to address your concerns.
Yeah,
So,
definitely. Yeah, just go to Amazon. That's probably the website you'll need to
okay.
post. Yeah. And
Gotcha.
then, because really the worksheets don't do any good unless you're going through the book.
Okay.
But yeah,
All right. Sounds good. Well, thank you again so much for joining us,
thank you for
Beth. I
having
appreciate it.
me.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.